Okay, very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for taking your time today to be here with us for this panel session. My name is Vignesh Varan Nair. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at the University of the Bahamas. It is our privilege to actually host this year's Earth Day 2020 panel session. So before I start, just some housekeeping. Please take note that this session is being recorded. All your microphone have been muted except for the panel speakers. For those of you who want to raise questions towards the end of the presentation, you can use the raise the hand option, or you can shoot your question in the chat box and we will try our best to answer as much as possible within the time limit that we have here. In order to manage the bandwidth more efficiently, those of you who do not need to use your video, you can stop the video so that you can hear the audio and also the presentation slides much better. Okay. So once again, thank you for taking your time during this global lockdown period that we are all in to listen to this session. For the Bahamas, it was a challenging end of 2019 as we struggle our way to bounce back after Hurricane Dorian. Thus, we expected 2020 was going to be a milestone year for the climate change crisis, which require a radical reversal of the current trajectory in terms of global greenhouse gas emission. But what we didn't know was that we would also face a global health crisis this year. Hence, the decisions we make now to tackle this imminent threat will affect us for generations to come, including our ability to halt global warming. The coronavirus pandemic is a tragedy and its consequences will be felt for a long time. Yet, though global health conditions will eventually return to a form of normal, our environment will never do so. There is no established link between COVID-19 and climate change. Nonetheless, the COVID-19 pandemic is painfully showing us that our challenges are increasingly global in nature and require systemic solution. Hence, for climate change, we need similar committed global actions. Emissions from every country accumulate in the atmosphere independently of where they are released. Therefore, cuts will only be effective if all nations are on the same trajectory, which is to move towards a net zero emission by at least 2050. That should be the global commitment by every country in this planet. The way we are altering the planet will make the spread of some diseases more likely as well. Each year, the world celebrates Earth Day on 22nd April, which is today. The first Earth Day was celebrated in the US in 1970, and it is said to have led to the creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the passing of the Clean Air, Clean Water and Endangered Species Act. So the main aim of Earth Day is to bring awareness to the importance of environmental protection and conservation. The commemoration of Earth Day has spread to more than 192 countries around the world, including our beautiful Bahamas. This year is the 50th anniversary of the Earth Day movement. And the University of the Bahamas is glad to host this panel amidst this global pandemic that we are in. As highlighted by the Earth Day Network, the theme for this year is climate action. And this event that we're having today is also being recorded and also being transmitted to the Earth Day Network. The enormous challenge, but also the vast opportunities of action on climate change have distinguished the issue as one of the most pressing topics for the 50th anniversary. Climate change represents one of the biggest challenges to the future of humanity and the life support system that make our world habitable. The scientific evidence is clear and irrefutable. Human activity is causing our planet to warm at an alarming rate. This is proved from the current global lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The lockdown has resulted in the following. Data from the Sentinel-5P satellite shows that nitrogen dioxide air pollution level have plummeted across Europe since the pandemic. Satellite images is also showing dramatic drops in air pollution in coronavirus hotspot around the globe. Photos of reduced smog in China and India, unpolluted canals in Italy, and wild animals roaming the streets in some part of the United States and many parts of Asia have been shared all over the social media. According to the Earth Day Network, international bodies of scientists have long warned that we have just over a decade to halve our emissions to avoid the most devastating impact of climate change on our food supply, national security, global health, extreme weather, and more. There's simply no time to waste, and 2020 is a key turning point for our planet. So there is an urgent need for all the stakeholders to do their part. As a nation, how is the current environmental challenges impacting us? The esteemed panel that we have assembled here today will discuss how the various stakeholders are playing their role in supporting this year's Earth Day theme, climate action, especially in the current global pandemic that we are facing. The Office of Graduate Studies and Research and the Small Island Sustainability Research Program at the University of the Bahamas presents you today the Earth Day 2020 panel session. We have today with us 5 panelists who will be addressing the 2020 themes of climate action. The panelists include, we have Dr. Nicholas Hicks, who is the Director of Cape Eleuthera Institute in Southern Eleuthera, the Bahamas. We do have Ms. Latonia Williams, Forestry Assistant at the Forestry Unit in the Bahamas, and she is also a student of the University of Bahamas at the Small Island Sustainability Program. We have Mr. Wayne Neely, international speaker, best-selling author and lecturer on hurricanes, educator and a meteorologist. We have Ms. Shirley Khan Woodside, the Director of Science and Policy of the Bahamas National Trust. And also we have our very own Dr. Carlton Watson, the Dean of the Faculty of Pure and Applied Sciences. Every panelist will be given briefly about 10 minutes to speak their thoughts on the topic. We will take all questions towards the end of the session. In the interest of the time, you are free to shoot any question via the chat box. So we will come back to your question once we have completed the panel discussion. So without further ado, let me now call our first panelist, Dr. Nicholas Hicks, to give his 10 minutes presentation. So Dr. Nicholas Hicks, I'm going to allow you to now share your screen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nair. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining this discussion. I will try my best to take less than 10 minutes because I really do look forward to some lively discussion rather than myself talking. And I will try and keep this fairly broad brushstrokes. So just to share a little bit about my background, I am an environmental scientist, marine biologist. And so I hope you can all see my screen now. Is that right?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so I wanted to start with this image for a couple of reasons. This is sandbanks just north of where we are located in Cape Eleuthera and South Eleuthera. And as Dr. Nair was saying, we live in a changing world. These sandbanks our world is somewhat stable, somewhat changing. Now, when I was a young boy growing up in North Eleuthera, I have already seen changes in my lifetime to our coastlines. There are houses built on land that didn't exist when I was a boy. And so these changes are happening all around us. And part of what we have to do as a scientist, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the first part of this, is what can science help us with, and how can science help us understand this? And as scientists, I think people look to us to provide answers. And I want to have a discussion about what we as scientists can and can't do. So what do we know? These brightly colored pictures here, the top image is an image of the current sea surface temperature under current climatic conditions. As you can see, there's a fair bit of variation from the cool central Atlantic to the slightly warmer central Caribbean. Now, if you look at the bottom picture, that is the current projected warming that we might expect to see by 2055, and this is sea surface temperature. Now, note, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a climate scientist, so I am by no means an expert on this, and I would leave it to Mr. Neely to further enlighten us on some of the detailed climate information. Now, what we do know is that, as Dr. Nair said, climate change is happening and it will be global in scale. However, it will not be uniform. The impacts of climate change we know are already happening in some places at a much faster rate than others. And so the question that I think we all want to know when we're thinking about climate change is, what do these changes mean for me locally? What does it mean for us here in the Bahamas? From those predictions there, we're looking at least a 1 degree Celsius rise in sea surface temperatures. Now, annual variability is much bigger than that. So what does it mean to say a 1 degree average sea surface temperature rise? And I think that's really what we're here for and what we want to know. Now, the problem is there is a lot of uncertainty in the scientific models at the local scale. And we in the Caribbean region suffer in particular because the models don't do so well at understanding the complex interactions that happen around islands. So there is a lot of uncertainty around the predictions of what we expect to happen at climate change. So as far as we know, we expect the Bahamas to be impacted by rising atmospheric and sea surface temperatures, by increasing sea level, which we can already model has happened in the last 100 years, and some of these other impacts. So the related impacts of ocean acidification, which is not part of climate change, but is also caused by increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there are all of these global scale predictions of what's going to happen, but then what are the local knock-on consequences? And that is difficult to predict for two reasons. Partly, as I said, because geographically, our region is very complicated, especially the Bahamas. But also, once you start to get down to the final scale, you're talking about complex systems. Now, as a marine biologist and an ecologist, I deal with ecosystems that are inherently very complex by nature. And, you know, I think physicists and biologists sometimes are very different kind of people, because I'm well used to handling uncertainty and complexity, and that's just part of my day-to-day. But I think that can be very difficult for people more generally to appreciate is the level of uncertainty that we face. Now, we as scientists, we can provide scenarios based on the best evidence we have. So when there are predictions made around changing climates, the impact of storms, the impact of rainfall. And, you know, those are very difficult to be certain about. One thing that we are certain about is that there is change. So what does that uncertainty mean? And really, what do we do in the face of that uncertainty? And that's the theme of this whole panel discussion, is what can we do even though we don't have all the details ironed out? And really, that's what we focus on here at the Cape Luther Institute and at our sister institute, the Center for Sustainable Development. And I think a lot of this falls under a couple of key categories. One that is what I'm going to call building resilience. And you'll have heard a lot of this, especially in the wake of the major hurricanes. So in the faces of uncertainty, if we can't be exactly sure about what's going to happen, we can do our best to prepare. So what does that look like? Well, that looks like growing more food, being less reliant on food imports. This is our aquaponics facility at our Center for Sustainable Development here in South Luther. And this is an established, well-working system that allows us to produce enough greens to feed our entire workforce year-round with lettuce and other greens. Now, that is a model that we would love to see more widely rolled out across the Bahamas, and that's something that our food security team actively works on. In the same vein, we need to manage our fisheries sustainably. This is an area of research that I work on. I show the lobster here because our lobster fishery in the Bahamas was recently accredited as a sustainable fishery. So we have a success here in the Bahamas, and we need to keep it that way. And we need to work with some of the other fisheries to get them there as well. A big one, we need to reduce consumption and waste. I think one of the biggest parts of our contribution towards climate change is the production of CO2 from all the things that we consume, from all the goods that we import and consume, you know, and along with food, almost all of the goods that we have here in the Bahamas and that we use in the Bahamas are imported. And we really need to cut back on this. And then, of course, we need to secure clean energy sources. So that's partly a security issue, and it's partly doing our part to reduce the impact of climate change. So that basically, in all of these ways, we can be better prepared for any changes that might come up. And this is a team here being trained in the installation of solar panels, working alongside some of our team from the Center for Sustainable Development. Now, the next category that I wanted to talk about was citizen activism. Now, I'm very much a believer that this action needs to happen at all levels, especially from the top down. So whilst we as individual citizens have responsibility, governments and those that we put in power have a serious onus on themselves to take responsibility to manage this. And I'm very much against blaming individual people for climate change and allowing big corporations and government to shirk their responsibilities. So really, as citizens, as individuals, we really need to ask governments, what is your plan for this? How are you planning for this? And individual members of parliament, speak to people. That is something you can do and hold our governments accountable. Secondly, the way we spend our money has almost a bigger impact, if not more, than who we vote for. Think about how we spend our money. Installing solar panels in your own home might be a better investment than your next cruise. And then finally, the main thing, be a positive example in your community, because that's really how we're going to tackle this, is changing behaviors. Every time I come to Nassau for a meeting, I have to wear a jacket because I am freezing, because everybody there seems to keep the air condition down at 65. You won't find any air condition in any of our workspaces. here at the KP Lutheran Institute. It's just not necessary. Now, I'm not saying we need to get rid of air conditioning. It has its place. But I think we really need to think about our resource use. And I'll leave it there. I don't want to take too much longer because I want to have a lot of debate and discussion. But in the face of uncertainty, why all of these things that I've just spoken about would be great to do anyway. So I think regardless of whether we know exactly what's going to happen, we can do all these things to make ourselves better prepared. And I'll leave it there and look forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. Okay, we will move to our second presenter, Ms. Latonia Williams, who is also, as I've said, a UB student, and she's also attached to the forestry unit of Bahamas. Latonia, do you have a video to show, or you are just going to speak?
I have a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, you can share it.
Yeah. Okay.
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 Great.
Good afternoon again to all, and thank you for having me here. As you are aware, my name is Latonia Williams. I am currently employed with the forestry unit as a forest supervisor. And as Dr. Vic mentioned, I am also currently enrolled with the University of the Bahamas as an ecotourism and sustainable development major in the SIS program. So just to give you an overview of what I intend to discuss, I won't go too much into the importance of forests, but I really want to bring about the impacts of climate change on forests, as well as the impacts of Hurricane Dorian, and to give you a snapshot of some of the observations that the forestry unit would have observed during our ground truthing exercises, as well as I want to discuss a way forward to enhance our efforts here in the country. So just to give you an idea of forest, for those who are not aware, there is actually a definition of forest. The FAO defines a forest as any area of 0.5 hectares, which is more or less equates to 2.5 acres or larger, having at least 10% crown cover with trees at least 3 meters in height or greater. And forests actually cover more than 31% of the land surface. More than 300 million people worldwide live in forests, and it's estimated that 70% of the world's species depend on forests for their homes. And for those who are not familiar with the various forest types in the Bahamas, I always think it's important to share that first and foremost, the Bahamas does have forests, because oftentimes when we speak to persons during our school visits or our sessions, persons would ask, does the Bahamas actually have forests? And so, yes, we do. We have 3 types. We recognize we have pine forest, mangrove forest, as well as our coppice forest, which most Bahamians like to call bush. The forestry unit, as I mentioned, is mandated under the Forestry Act 2010 to manage forests on Crown lands. And the Act also speaks to the process of establishing a national forest estate, which provides the legal framework for the protection of forests. And it's estimated that the proposed NFE will protect more than 600,000 acres of all forest types in the Bahamas. So the state of the affairs, forests are essential to life, providing many services to humans and wildlife, including regulatory, supporting provision, and cultural services like microclimate regulation, soil formation, food, construction materials, and recreation. However, despite the importance of forests, many forest areas are threatened globally, from deforestation and many other activities, including forest degradation. And for those who are unaware, deforestation is a term simply referring to the permanent removal of standing trees. It's actually estimated that we are losing 18.7 million acres of forest annually. That's equivalent to 27 soccer fields every minute. Other threats to forests include natural disasters, invasive species, as well as climate change. And in the interest of climate action, it's important to really get an idea of what those impacts from climate change would actually incur on the forest. Climate change could alter the frequency and intensity of forest disturbances such as insect outbreaks, invasive species, wildfires, and storms. And these disturbances often reduce forest productivity and change the distribution of tree species. In some cases, forests can recover from the disturbance, but in other cases, the existing species may shift their range or even die out. And in these cases, it's estimated that persons have actually seen new species of vegetation that colonize the area, create a new type of forest. As you can see, most of the impacts on climate change relate to wildfires, invasive plants, pest outbreaks, and extreme weather. And just to really segue into extreme weather, we are all aware of Hurricane Dorian and the impacts it had on our country last year. It devastated our northern Bahama Islands, Abaco and Grand Bahama. Many persons' lives were lost. Unfortunately, many homes destroyed, many infrastructure damaged, and many of our environment was really impacted as well. And so just to really give you an idea of the extent of the damages that occurred, this map actually just gives you a preview of some of the areas that the forestry unit actually proposes within the National Forest Estate. And this just shows you the extent of damages that occurred. And Hurricane Dorian, as you're aware, was reported to be the strongest hurricane to hit the Bahamas in memory as well as history. And so what we wanted to do, we began doing in-house photo imagery analysis. Hopefully during the discussion, Dr. Vic would allow me to just to give you a snapshot of what we gathered with some of our partners. But we were able to do some ground truthing exercise. And what we wanted to do was to really to complete a rapid assessment to more or less determine the extent of damages of those forest resources on Abaco and Grand Bahama. And just for those who have not been in the forest for a very long time, these are just some pictures of what we would have captured in the forest during our regular exercises, and more or less to give you an idea of the pre-forest conditions on Abaco and Grand Bahama. So during our, more or less, during our analysis, I'll go into the extent of the damages. During our analysis, what we recognized was that more than 100% of our proposed national forest in Grand Bahama was impacted. We, as you can see, based on our area damage class, we more or less had a scale of minimal to moderate to severe and catastrophic. And in the cases of catastrophic, that more or less spoke to where trees were more or less 50% damaged, multiple trees down, and more or less a salvage operation was needed. And what we recognize is that most of the areas in Grand Bahama were impacted, as well as 86% of the National Forest Estate on Abaco was impacted. The total acreage, as you can see, was at least more than 70,000 acres on Grand Bahama, as well as 33,000 on Abaco. And what we recognized when we saw, as you can see, the observations revealed that severe to catastrophic damage to all of the forest types occurred. The natural pine forests that were densely populated, as you would have seen, were healthy and productive. These were areas were essentially destroyed. In addition to the very strong 185 mile per hour winds, I'm sure Dr. Neely would discuss, um, tornadoes spurned, salt water inundated, and our ground truth exercises actually revealed that there were widespread canopy loss and the loss of an understory pine stems, branch breakages, uprooted and overthrown trees. Where there was forest, the trees were completely brown, discolored, and even there were, as you can see in the lower corner, there were vast areas of just standing dead trees. Due to the loss of the understory, we actually observed, you could see the bare limestone in many cases. And with respect to the mangroves, as you can see, there was defoliation and the crop roots were remaining in muddy wetlands. We also saw five forest fires that were occurring that occurred on Grand Bahama during this ground truthing exercise. And just because we are mandated as the caretakers to protect and manage forests, we are dedicated to restoring the forest in an effort to, we don't want it to remain the same. And because we have some of these plans that we would have discussed, and it includes installing fire breaks. For those who aren't aware, once a storm occurs, you have more or less, the forest is dry, we would have had saltwater intrusion. So the environment is ideal for a fire. And so we have to more or less open those roads up and clear those roads up so we can create some sort of fire breaks to decrease fires if they do occur for expanding any further. As we mentioned, this is also only a preliminary assessment that we did. So we would like to complete a comprehensive assessment, also with the assistance of the FAO and of course our local partners. We recently requested for an EOI, which would more or less help with the removal of the of the damaged trees, because as you are aware, dying trees, more or less, they are a medium for insects, pests, fire, as well as they release a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. As well, and the next step that we want to take is a prescribed burn. For those who aren't aware, and when they hear fire, prescribed burns actually would assist in this particular environment. Our pine forest actually fire dependent, and so in this instance, we would help to actually release nutrients and help to regenerate the forest areas. And so what we recognize is that the forestry unit cannot do this alone. It requires partnerships. It requires planning. It requires commitment and execution. We have existing legislation. However, we've yet to establish the national forest estate. And obviously, most of the work that we do requires funding. And so in an effort, as we speak about climate action, we thought it would be important to really speak about that. The forestry unit, granted it's our mandate to manage these forests, we understand and we recognize that it requires a national commitment. And the reality is that the country has made many national commitments, especially as it relates to forests. We've actually committed on globally via our international commitments. In an effort to mitigate and adapt to climate change. One way we recognize to mitigate climate change is actually the establishment of the National Forest Estate. And just to quote from our NDC, it actually says that it is envisaged that the establishment of the NFE will deliver those global environment benefits along with domestic livelihood support and development, and seek to safeguard future land degradation of forest lands. Enhanced management will improve our ecosystems to ensure linkages to reefs that are protected, sea grasses, and as well as sustainable livelihood and carbon sink abilities. So once as we speak about COVID-19, I know a lot of persons are talking about the new Bahamas and what is the government doing and how can we really maximize and create a local environment where we can sustain ourselves. And one of the ways, believe it or not, we can do that is through sustainable forest management. As we would have mentioned, we have ample supplies of forest resources that are actually in need of management. And one of our methods of managing our forests is actually through thinning exercises. And through those thinning exercises, you can have timber production, you can create employment, as was the case in a previous exercise that we had on Abaco, where we had a pilot project and persons were able to be trained, they were able to be employed. And as you can see, you have lovely products that can be made from our beautiful Pinus scarabea, Barbara Jimenez's furniture. We have our coppice forest that can provide sustainable livelihood opportunities for boat building. And our straw crafts, for those who are not familiar, the straw that's used in most of our crafts actually comes from the pine forest, as well as we have other forest resources, Cascarilla down there in the southeastern Bahamas. There's opportunity to really increase our opportunity to increase our opportunities to really help those communities to sustain and provide for themselves. And so, in an effort to really address climate change, we thought that it's important to establish the National Forest Estate. And as well as we would have mentioned, it requires more than just the forestry unit, it requires a national effort. And we all hope that everybody understands that Dorian has done extreme damages to our forests, but like Dr. Higgs has said, we what do we do next? How can we more or less improve our local livelihoods? How can we sustain ourselves? I look forward to the discussions about how we can enhance our sustainable forest management initiatives in the country. And I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Latonia. Okay. Can I now next call Mr. Neely to address the floor today? Mr. Neely.
My name is Wayne Neely. I'm a forecaster. I've been working at the Department of Meteorology for 29 years. I've written 14 best-selling books on hurricanes, mostly off the Bahamas and the Caribbean. And my latest book, The Greatest and Deadliest Hurricanes of the Bahamas, to impact the Bahamas, that was #1 on Amazon for the month of December, for the entire month of December, for all book weather related. And I'm going to start with a thing that caught my attention. And start by saying that not so long, climate change was simply regarded as something so vague, threat-wise, that it would impact only the future generations of mankind. I can definitely say, it's clear to say those days have long passed. Today, the overwhelming majority of scientists believe that gradual heating of our planet is due in part to trapping of greenhouse gases, and that it's a serious crisis that is not only accelerating rapidly and much must be addressed immediately. That was taken from Time magazine's Global Warming, the causes, pearls, and the solutions. And my first, I started with a question, is the Earth's temperature really changing? And I can say without a shadow of a doubt, as a meteorologist, I can say yes. And like I said, I am a 29-year veteran. The temperatures that I'm seeing now didn't exist when I started 29 years ago. And many of the records that were long held records, I've seen most of them have been broken within the last five years or so. And as everyone has heard from the media, recent years have consistently been the warmest in hundreds and possibly thousands of years. Man-induced climate change is caused by the rapid increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, principally from the burning of fossil fuels. Climate change could pose a great disadvantage in terms of risks to the islands of the Caribbean and here in the Bahamas. The environmental changes expected to affect the Caribbean are first of all, a rise in sea level, stronger hurricanes, and most important, most people don't think about it, but longer dry seasons and shorter wet seasons. And we here in the Bahamas, I've seen that significantly change. The rainfall weather patterns have changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years. In fact, I'd say the last 10 years, principally, we normally had a rainy season from April to end of May. That doesn't exist anymore. We get some rainfall, but significantly below the climatological average. And as a result, the environment changes expected to affect the Caribbean are a rise in sea levels, stronger hurricanes, longer dry seasons, and shorter wet seasons. Now, the climate change expected to lead to changes in the economy, environment, and population of the Caribbean. An increase in air and sea surface temperatures is predicted to promote development of stronger hurricanes. Key factors that lead to development of hurricanes are warm sea surface temperatures of the air and in the sea surface. And higher temperatures increase the probability of the storm to become a hurricane. This provides energy for the hurricane to intensify. In September of 2017, the United States National Hurricane Center reported that the North Atlantic Hurricane Basin was highly active for 4 tropical storms formed, and they all became hurricanes. They report a higher than average record of the number of tropical storms that developed into hurricanes this year. 2 of those 4 hurricanes, Irma and Maria, hit the islands of the Caribbean. One of them, Maria, notably Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is still feeling the detrimental effects from that storm. And both Irma and Maria became Category 5 hurricanes. And what's amazing about that is that NASA reported that the temperatures of the sea surface in the Caribbean when Irma became a hurricane was 30.0 degrees, 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. The required temperature for hurricanes to grow and thrive is 26.5 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And back closer to home, when Dorian struck, the sea surface temperature was 1.3 degrees Celsius above normal, and that resulted in what we now know as the monster Dorian that we've experienced in Grand Bahama and Abaco in the Bahamas. In the Bahamas, Hurricane Joaquin in 2015, Matthew in 2016, Irma in 2017, and Dorian devastated the Bahamas and cost over $5 billion in damages to the economy of the Bahamas alone. This was the most active era for hurricanes in the Bahamas since the late 20s and early 1930s. Hurricanes of Category 5 intensity of wind speeds greater than 157 miles per hour. In addition to being strong hurricanes, Hurricanes Noel in 2007, Dorian of 2019, and Matthew of 2016 have carried more rainfall than previous storms that impacted the Bahamas. The warmer air temperature, the more water or what we call moisture that can be held by the air surrounding it leads to more precipitation. More moisture in the atmosphere results in more energy being released to these storms through what we know as a process called latent heat condensation. With warmer temperatures, you get more moisture into the atmosphere. With more moisture, it results in feed the hurricane more, significantly more energy, and that in turn results in stronger winds, and in many cases, significant amount more rainfall. And this leads to more intense hurricanes, and multiple sources, including a noted professor, a friend of mine, Kerry Emanuel from MIT, who's perhaps one of the guys, one of the foremost experts in climate change in this region, suggests that this increase is strengthening and the wind speeds and the precipitation in hurricanes due to this climate change impact. We are seeing repeated and prolonged droughts, an increase in the number of very hot days, intense rainfall events, causing repeated localized flooding and rising sea levels that are consuming beautiful beaches, which tourism in the region depends so highly on. And what we know about past trends in terms of sea surface temperatures over the last several years, sea surface temperatures for the last 15, 20 years, sea surface temperatures have been 0.5 to 0.7 degrees. That's 0.9 to 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century in the main development area of this area for cyclones in the North Atlantic. And the main development areas, there are 4 standard areas that when we talk about main development area for hurricanes. That is the Southern Caribbean Sea, the Central Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and east of the Bahamas, and what we get we get tough low pressure systems forming and they develop into hurricanes. And there's very little that human-induced greenhouse warming has contributed to this trend. Warm sea surface temperatures are required and essential for hurricane genesis. What we know about, in terms of outlook for future hurricane intensity, the sea surface temperature is expected to increase about 1.7 degrees Celsius, according to the World Meteorological Organization. Temperatures about to increase about 1.7 degrees Celsius or 3.1 degrees Fahrenheit over the 21st century if no reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases are possible. Most models project a modest increase in hurricane intensity, maximum winds to increase by 2 to 13% over the century, and core rainfall rates increase to 10 to 31%. Now, 2 to 13% doesn't seem like much, but that can mean the difference between a category 3 intensity hurricane or to a category 5. And we've seen the results of a category 5 on Abaco and Grand Bahama with Dorian. And the core rainfall rate is expected to increase 10 to 31% over the next in the 21st century. And that's going to result in the Bahamas. That's going to be devastating for the Bahamas because the highest height in the Bahamas is 250 feet, which is in Cat Island. And most of the areas are under 27 feet above sea level. So that would pose significant flooding. And in fact, to a great extent, we've now already seen that in many locations of not only in New Providence, but around the Bahamas. And in fact, many of you would know that there's certain areas that never used to flood that are now flooding now. And we can induce that to climate change and the impact of climate change. Consider this, according to the World Meteorological Organization, from 1983 to 2013, that was the warmest 30-year period for 1,400 years on planet Earth. 13 of the 15 years on record have all occurred since 2000, and the odds of that happening randomly without the presence of global warming is 1 in 27 million. And I'm closer to home on Sunday, which was the 19th of April, which was on Sunday, we recorded the warmest maximum temperature on record for the month of April. Temperature got up to 34.5. So if you felt hot on last week, that's not just in your mind. That was actually the record. We've broken the record. 34.5 is the highest record we've ever had for the month of April since we started keeping records in the early 1920s. And the month on July 14 and 15 of last year were the second and third warmest Julys on record at LPI at Linden Peninsula International Airport since we started keeping records in the early 1920s. And that's the warmest. Those two temperatures were the second and third highest temperature we got on record. So we can say that you can chalk it up to say it's the chances, but the chances of that occurring so frequently, you're gonna have to deduce that something else is causing that. And one thing I attribute that would be climate change and the impact of climate change, not only here in the Bahamas, but region-wise as well. Globally, July 2019 was the warmest July on record and in the summer of 2015, which ended in September 23rd, 2015, it ended as the hottest in 135 years of recorded data, according to the World Meteorological Organization. The global land and ocean temperatures for the summer were 1.53 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the 20th century average. When Hurricane Dorian struck the Bahamas, it had a sea surface temperature, like I said before, it had a sea surface temperature of 1.3 degrees Celsius above the climatological normal. And that resulted in a monster storm that we've seen firsthand. And I gather to say that for the next 10, 15 years, we will still be dealing with the repercussions from Hurricane Dorian and if there's any future hurricanes occurring. And in terms of worldwide, the 6 strongest hurricanes and typhoons on record have occurred since have occurred since 1970. And I just use 1970 as a base because I want to include one particular storm. In 2019, Hurricane Dorian had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. Dorian is the strongest hurricane on record to strike the Bahamas since we began keeping records. It replaced the Great Abaco Hurricane of 1932 in terms of strength. That storm had 160 mile per hour winds, and it was a Category 5. We've only had 4 Category 5 hurricanes impacting the Bahamas. One was in 1932, one was in 1933, the Great Abaco Hurricane in 1932, the Cuba Bronx Hill Hurricane of 1934, of 1933, and Andrew of 1992, and then we had Dorian in 2019. And that's a record. To have a Category 5 hurricane impacting the nation is extremely rare. The only person we had 4. The only person who have the same amount, we tied at number 1 in the region, that would be the United States. The United States have 4 Category 5 hurricanes impacting them within the last, since 1851, since we've been keeping more accurate records. Other places like in the Southern Caribbean, they've never experienced a Category 5 hurricane. In some cases, there's some islands they've only experienced 1 in all their lifetime of existence. So we in the Bahamas, and the reason why we in the Bahamas have that record is because we rely, geographical location puts us directly in the path of all 4 types of hurricanes impacting the North Atlantic. And of 4 types of hurricanes impacting North Atlantic, the Bahamas is hit by all 4 of them. In places like Barbados and Trinidad, they're only impacted by 1. In Central America, they only impacted by, to most extent, 2 types of storms, 2 of the 4 types. So it stands to reason that they will get less recorded Category 5 storms. And in 2019, Dorian had sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. And Dorian is tied with the Great Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 for the highest sustained winds at landfall in the North Atlantic. And by the same metric, it is also the strongest North Atlantic hurricane since Hurricane Wilma of 2005. And in terms of atmospheric pressure, it's the 5th hurricane and lowest pressure reading upon landfall. And a lot of people are saying that it's the most intense storm that we've had in the North Atlantic. In terms of intensity in the north, in terms of landfall, means that the part that it had during landfall, it is number 1 tied with the Great Labor Day Hurricane. But in terms of strength of Category 5 intensity, Hurricane Wilma of 2005 still remains the top storm, the most intense hurricane to impact the region. And that's followed by Gilbert of 1988. And in globally, the records are also falling globally as well. In 2015, Hurricane Patricia in the Eastern Pacific reached top wind speeds of 201 miles per hour on October 23rd, 2015. And prior to that, it became the strongest hurricane on record in terms of wind speed and globally. In 2013, you had Typhoon Haiyan. It remains the strongest hurricane in the Western Pacific, and it was deadly and destructive. Haiyan had winds of 195 miles per hour and it slammed into the Philippines in November 2013. And it was the deadliest typhoon on record in the Philippines, leaving more than 7,300 people dead or missing, and primarily responsible for massive 15 to 19-foot storm surge that demolished and swept away everything in its path. And that's a record. And consider the Philippines on average gets hit by 8 storms a year, whereas we in the Bahamas only get by 1 storm. But every year they have deal on average 8 storms a year. Some days you have lower amounts, and some days you have a greater amount. So that's a record. And there's significant other records that I can go. In 1980, Hurricane Allen struck the North Atlantic with 190 mile per hour winds. And it's one of the strongest to impact this region. And in 1979, the reason why I include 1979, Super Typhoon Tip in the Western Pacific is regarded as the strongest hurricane on record globally. And this is one of the arguments that most people who maintain that hurricanes are not becoming strong is not making them. They always point to Super Typhoon Tip, which occurred in 1979. they're saying that if the hurricanes were becoming stronger, why has we not seen the record of typhoon in 1979 being broken? Well, Tip had a maximum sustained winds of 189 miles per hour, and it's the world record for the lowest barometric pressure reading. It had a barometric pressure of 25.69, recorded in tropical cyclone. In addition to wind speed, intensity can be measured by barometric pressure. The lower the number, the more powerful it is, and it's perhaps the most powerful storm on record that we've had. That record, I don't know how long it's going to be there, but if the trend continues, I think that it stands to reason that will be broken as well. And then we have Hurricane Wilma of 2005, and that was the most intense storm on record. Wilma devastated. Wilma,
can you try to wrap up, because your
okay.
time is way off. Thank you.
I'm finished. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And Wilma had a pressure of 82 millibars, and it was the most intense storm on record. And that's it. And I wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for cutting you off. We're trying to keep up with the time today.
Okay.
Following Ms. Anili, can I now call upon Ms. Shirley Woodside from the Bahamas National Trust to address the floor today?
Yes.
Yes,
hello,
Shirley.
everybody. Yes. I'm just trying to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Hello?
No, not yet.
No, we don't see your screen yet.
Okay. Hang on. Okay, everybody see my screen now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, right. Hello, everybody. My name is Shelley Kent Woodside, and I'm the Director of Science and Policy with the Bahamas National Trust. Today, I'm going to be talking about building resilience against climate change, but particularly from the point of view of the Bahamas National Trust and some of the things that we've been thinking about and working towards. But just to give a little brief history to remind people, the Bahamas National Trust actually was established in 1959, mandated as an act of parliament to manage the national park system of the country. And we were actually set up as a nonprofit, non-governmental organization, but with a statutory authority to manage the resources of both land and sea. And this all started with the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, but today we actually manage 32 national parks covering more than 2.2 million acres of both land and sea. Now, even though national parks are at the very heart of what we do at the Bahamas National Trust, we do operate under several different pillars. For today's conversation, though, I'm really going to be talking from the point of view of our biodiversity conservation pillar. And a lot of this work under the biodiversity conservation work comes through the department, the science department within the Bahamas National Trust. Now, we actually have 4 different strategies that we work towards to help improve biodiversity into a changing and unpredictable future. And one is to ensure functioning habitats. Another one is protecting species in peril. The next one is science that benefits all, and that basically speaks to making science available to policymakers, educators, and the general public. And then we also have one known as thinking globally, where we are trying to make sure that we're integrating international policies and best practices into our work. But one thing that I do want to state is that managing a changing climate is written into all aspects of the work of the Bahamas National Trust. And the reason why is basically because climate change does impact biodiversity at all levels. And so we have to think about it constantly for our work. Now, many of us already understand that the Bahamas is one of the most susceptible countries in the world, especially to the effects of sea level rise when we're talking about climate change. And this is basically because we are an archipelago of such low-lying islands, with 93% of our total landmass being classified as low elevation coastal zone. So sea level rise is one of those very major threats, not even to mention that we sit in a very active hurricane belt. One of the issues that I find in the Bahamas, but also around the world, is that many people do not understand what climate change really actually looks like on the local scale. And so I often use this image to get people to understand what the face of climate change actually looks like. Unfortunately, as sea levels continue to rise and salt water is brought further and further inland with every increasing storm, unfortunately, we are going to see more and more examples of pictures on the right compared to, unfortunately, the pictures on the left. And the same can be said in the marine environment. We're seeing this over and over again, where the complexity of coral reef environments, for example, are slowly being degraded. So basically, the Bahamas National Trust strategy to combat climate change really is all about trying to implement what is known as ecosystem-based adaptation, also referred to as nature-based adaptation. This basically has been hailed internationally as one of the most effective tools to help build resilience to climate change. By simply including nature into our planning, by using the natural and very resilient ability of ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves, but also countless more seagrasses, etc., we could actually engineer our coastlines to help remove excess energy out of the waves. These ecosystems also are pretty good at trapping sediments, etc., and are really good natural defense mechanisms against a lot of the threats, particularly coming from things like hurricanes. The wonderful thing about integrating ecosystems into building resilience also is that it comes with a whole host of other benefits. Because you're creating an entire environment with, built for other wildlife to live in it, that also means that there's more food availability, there's also areas for recreational use, and a whole host of other benefits to both people as well as biodiversity. And one thing that's really great about these strategies is that they do tend to be a lot cheaper to install compared to traditional engineering methods, like if I compare it to things like seawalls, levees, and revetments. And they also have this ability to almost repair themselves. Sometimes they need a little bit of help, like we have seen in some aspects of East Grand Bahama, but generally they are much cheaper to maintain. And one added benefit is they also capture carbon dioxide, so they're also helping reduce the problem at the source. Now, ecosystem-based adaptation is basically planned for in a way where you basically monitor, you plan, you respond, and repeat. A constant cycle of trying to evaluate and respond to a certain threat and to adapt your practices, because with a changing environment, there are going to be variables that are going to be changing and things that humans have not even thought about as of yet. And so the Bahamas National Trust is always writing this into our project plans, particularly for managing national parks. But as we start helping with the departments, governmental departments like Ministry of Works, for example, we're also integrating a lot of these same practices into that. And one thing that I do like to throw in there that many of these models do not have is that we must involve local communities at every point along this process to be able to get full buy-in from the local communities, and especially because a lot of these communities are going to be impacted by climate change. We need to get them involved so they can have a good understanding about what resilience means and how to help make their livelihoods more resilient. Another thing that I like to try and think about is how can we integrate more alternative livelihoods into whatever project that we are designing. We know that economics is very important to all people, and if you can find a solution that is going to help biodiversity and build resilience, but also is going to be able to make some, you know, some money and improve the economy, then it's definitely a win-win. Now, the Bahamas National Trust also operates when it comes to building climate resiliency projects. We have a certain set of principles that we also work with. One very important one is to integrate scientific methodology into the project. So not only are we monitoring our restoration project or monitoring the national park that we're working in, I'm designing it as an experiment. So I'm also picking areas to use as a control that I can measure the effectiveness of my site compared to the other area that we're not working in. Another important thing is to test different approaches. So instead of coming back and doing the exact same methodology over and over and over, just encouraging staff and project managers to always come up with new approaches and test it. So I'm going to try this approach on this side, whereas that area I'm going to try something else, and actually have some monitoring to test the methods in between. And then one of the most important things I feel is that we need to be really good record keepers and publish our results, because we need to help build upon the good work of others, and also lay our work out there so it can be critically analyzed and improved moving forward. Another important principle is what I call the biodiversity principles. And these principles just ask us to think of these projects on 3 different levels. So one is the ecosystem level. So if I'm doing a restoration project, instead of just planting a wetland, I want to think of what other habitats I can include, like could the area really benefit with some work on coral reef, as well as seagrass beds, as well as the wetland, to help amplify the effectiveness of the restoration project. And then you have the species level. And this is basically asking you to think about not just planting red mangroves, which are really easy to plant, or acropora coral, because they're really easy to grow, but actually what are the different species that we can incorporate into the restoration project so that we can actually get the ecosystem functioning as quickly as possible. So red mangrove, black mangrove, white mangrove, etc. And then there is the genetic level, and this level tends to be forgotten about the most when concerning restoration projects, but it is really important to understand how diverse the genetic pool is that you're bringing the plants from, because, or corals, because if you have very reduced genetic diversity, you're just leaving the area vulnerable to disease outbreaks, and also less adaptability to this changing environment. And really the aim of the game is to try and make sure that we increase adaptability of these systems. Another thing is just to consider is spatial and temporal considerations. And this just speaks to always think big and small. So make sure the projects are large enough to actually achieve the ecological functioning that you want, but also think on a very small level. What are the tiny little modifications you can do to really increase complex structures? The more complex the structure, the better it's going to be able to take out energy from waves and things like that. And then also seasonal conditions as well. Many people forget coastal environments are actually very dynamic, and they ebb and flow with the seasons. You know, winter tends to be more, you know, very different from the summer, and we have to build our projects with that in mind. These are dynamic systems. And then the last principle that we like to always remind ourselves is to just constantly try to innovate. We're going to have to think outside the box more and coming up with solutions that will benefit both biodiversity and people. And we have to think of some fun ways of blending the different approaches to help benefit everyone. And that's really it from me. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Last but not least, we have our final panelist, Dr. Carlton Watson. Dr. Watson, you have your slides that you can upload.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Vic. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
yes, we can.
so I note the time and I will try and move very quickly to be respectful of the time and the desire to have questions. And so I really just have a couple points. It's just a general theme, and there's some connections to what was said before, but as opposed to a technical talk, I'm really just speaking kind of conceptually about what in my mind is one of the important aspects in terms of climate action. So, and that to me is the role of the national university when we talk about climate action, and in particular the University of the Bahamas. And so when we talk about climate action, I'm a firm believer of, there's a saying, if you have 6 hours to chop down a tree, pardon that analogy, Shelley, but that you spend 4 of those hours sharpening your axe. And I think that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln. And so it's important that, hello? So it's important that as we move forward, we revisit our climate action plan and that we develop the culture of developing climate action plans at all levels. And so this is an example. We have a climate action plan. I didn't present it for the Bahamas, but it's very difficult to find. If you search the internet, you'll see that it's very difficult to find. So the question is, at what level is that plan a part of the national conversation, as a part of the national psyche and discussion? This action plan that you see here is really from the city of Fife in Scotland. But if you search the internet, you'll find at all levels there are action plans. But I think that's important. And it's important that the university, hello?
You're good, carry on.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm hearing some feedback, sorry. But the action plan is important because it guides us. It helps to constrain our actions, even though there may not be the details that are needed, but it then helps to constrain those actions so that we can then start to fill in from the skeleton. And so I think that's one thing that's very important moving forward, that we develop that. This is the city of Fife, like I said, in Scotland, but also at the university level. And this is something that we are working on at the University of Bahamas. This is an example of Boston University's climate action plan. So I think one thing that we can do as NGOs, as various activists, as university partners, is to really push for the adoption of action plans at all levels, at ministry levels, at national levels, at institutional levels, and that they are aligned so that as we move forward, we are constantly checking against our action plan and also interrogating the action plan to see how we now change. I mean, I'm sure that there will be some new thinking coming out of the COVID pandemic. So when we talk about the role of the university, so beyond the action plan, these are some fundamental things that's general to universities and national universities. Of course, the fundamental purpose of universities is to educate. There's also the role of being a source for data and analytics, for research and innovation, and to also make connections. And in the Bahamas, I will also add, I see the University of the Bahamas as being playing a role in terms of adding stability, and I'll speak to all of these very quickly. So when we talk about education, we're talking about graduate and undergraduate programs, short courses, general education, and I think that's what distinguishes a university, say, from training centers, is that we also are focusing, and this is not to say one is better than the other, but to also, we're educating citizens beyond a particular discipline. And that's very important when we start talking about climate, because as as Nick emphasized, at the citizen level, we have to inspire activism, and that can only happen if people are more educated. We talk about data and analytics. Shelley made the point about data, which is very important. What we find as one of the gaps and challenges within the country, and many countries, this is not unique to the Bahamas, is that there are few systems at the national level where data can be easily accessed, and that data can be used to inform policy and decision making. One of the core functions of the university, of course, is research and innovation. And this was the big shift in 2016 when University of Bahamas transitioned from college to university. The expectation is that we move not only from an institution that transmit information, but we also generate new knowledge and innovation. And so it is important in the context of climate action that we continue to, or that we play a larger role into addressing socioeconomic and environmental challenges, but also to utilize innovation for economic development. And additionally, as a national university, I think it's very important that the university be seen as a point to make connections. We have lots of institutions in the country that are doing tremendous work, and the various ministries, and sometimes getting everyone to connect, to communicate, to have conversations can be difficult because everyone is so busy doing the work that they need to do. But it is important to have a university that then can act as a hub, or to create the hub, or to facilitate, or to be a part of hubs and networks to ensure that that work is continuous. And lastly, I add stability. The university is seen as a neutral partner. It's insulated from the politics, whether we're talking national politics, or ideally it should be insulated from politics. And it's continuous beyond the individual. It's eternal, or it should be strive to be eternal. Now I want to speak briefly about, so these are just general thoughts about the role of University of Bahamas in terms of climate action, but I will talk about one set of initiatives that or one focus in terms of the work that I'm doing within the Small Island Sustainability Research Complex. In terms of education, as you know, we had Ms. Williams on, who is not only within the forestry unit, but also one of our brightest and best students within the SIS program. And so we continue to develop programs in marine, sustainable agriculture and fisheries, and we're developing master's programs. We're also looking at laboratory, we also have laboratory spaces devoted to eco-informatics. As you may know, this is not within the SISRC, but we continue to also partner with our new institution, CAR, Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center, headed by my colleague, Dr. Adele Thomas. And we want to play a larger role in terms of capturing environmental data, but also land use data. And I think that is one of the areas that we see is crucial. And Shelley did make the point, which is very good, that, you know, as we look at biodiversity, we want to look at sustainable livelihoods. We at SISRC, we really start from the sustainable livelihoods and then look at the environment, because what we realize, if we're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have to meet people. There are many folks that we have to meet at their socioeconomic conditions. It's, in other words, job creation. How do we look at jobs? How do we look at livelihoods? But as we do that, build in the environment. In other words, putting people at the center. And so what we've been very focused on is through our sustainable agriculture and fisheries is building research in terms of aquaculture, reestablishing the poultry unit, and also looking at hydroponics and aquaponics. We're developing facilities on campus, and had it not been for COVID, we would probably been well ahead in terms of finalizing some of those things. But we see this as important, not only at the individual level, but there's been lots of discussion about economic diversity or diversification. And what is always interesting to me is that there is a lot of discussion about it, but quite often I think there is a glaring absence of the recognition for the university. And I think that if moving forward, it is important that we utilize the research and innovation if we are going to be successful in developing a diverse economy. It's not going to be something that is that happens overnight. I think a lot of people are talking about agriculture. We have to give a lot of thought about agriculture. There are some tremendous opportunities, but there are also some tremendous threats when we talk about climate change. And so if we think about climate action in the context of agriculture and economic diversification, then the question is, how do we develop a more resilient and sustainable agricultural sector, cognizant of the fact that the likelihood of us getting another hurricane in the next 10 years is pretty high. And again, making connections, we continue to work with the ministries and private sector, and to work with international partners to develop educational programs and research. And we want to continue to build on that. And so this is my last slide. So just for points of discussion, I hope we can have some time for questions. Again, connecting the work that we do through sustainable livelihoods to climate action is, obviously mitigation, the discussion about climate action centered around mitigation, but we also know that that extends beyond mitigation and talking about adaptation and resilience. And so we're talking about, from a sectoral approach, and if I must look at agriculture, but the same applies for tourism or any of the other sectors, is how do we develop that sector so that it's more resilient? And how do we utilize the university to provide solutions in that regard? How do we balance conservation and sustainable livelihoods again? And if we're talking about diversification of the economy, how do we talk about the blue-green economy where there are lots of opportunities, and to continue to build local capacities and expertise, and that whatever we do, we're informed by experts, data, and research. And we see that this, even in this discussion about the pandemic, this question about listening to the experts. So in that regard, I think we need to focus more on, as we build the expertise, we want to also make sure that we're utilizing those expertise. And that's why I think it's important in this last point, as we build the university, that we focus on retaining our brightest and best students, brightest and best faculty, because I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that there's nothing guaranteed. These things that we take for granted, that we can go anywhere, that we can travel globally. And while we anticipate that this will always be something, and this is a positive feature, we also have to recognize that we have to be more locally sustainable or sustained, and have the capacity to do more of the things that we need to do for our own survival in-house. So that's all that I have to say in that regard, and I'll be happy to start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. Thank you so much for all the 5 panelists that have given us a good overview of the topic of climate change, climate action in their respective areas. So now I would like to open the floor. So before I start, I just want to shoot one question to all of you, a general question that any one of you can actually discuss. Do you think the future of sustainability of this planet will be dictated by the younger generation? You can see a lot of changes that is happening globally, especially in Sweden under Greta Thunberg and what she has been doing and how she has been rallying the younger generation. Do you think that is a way forward, even in the Bahamas? A general question before I take question from the floor. Any one of the panelists can respond to it.
Well, I would just start. So I would say certainly, and you know, while I did not say that explicitly, I think that's why it's important that as we develop programs at the university, that we continue to incorporate into our general education more coursework and subjects on climate change, on sustainability, so that the general population, even if they're not in areas directly related to climate change, they are more aware. If we're talking about teachers or just parents, the general public who are going to make decisions on elected officials. So we certainly, one of the things that I get when I teach a course on Physics 301, Energy, Society, and the Environment. And one of the things that it's quite a delight when students leave there and say, you know, I didn't know this, I wasn't aware of this. And you know now that you've made an impact, because here's a student who wasn't maybe a science major, an environmental major, or policy major, and they now have a different perspective that they can carry on in their into their everyday life.
Any other views?
I think I would add.
Yes, Nick.
I would add that you know, the next generation is the only hope we have. That, you know, the current generation has not done so well, but what it will require is a radical shift in our thinking. I think for the first time in humanity's history, we have to try and limit ourselves. And this is not something we have really had to do before. And that is the mindset that we're in now, that the next generation has to face. But it's not just about limiting, it's about innovation as well. And that comes down to daily changes in our behavior. You know, and I'll give concrete examples. We do not have any garbage bags on our entire campus here. All of our waste is sorted and washed for recycling at the point of use, okay? All our food waste goes to compost. That is something that I actually learned from my parents-in-law when I went to their house. No garbage bags, all of their waste was processed. And those are the habits that you create in the next generation. And every person that goes through our school here picks up those habits. And that is how we will make sure that the next generation is prepared to deal with this, by changing the status quo of how we live our day-to-day lives.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Yes, I think the younger generation now, they understand much clearer than we do as older adults, and they realize that what role we do will impact them. So many of them, like Greta, she's led the way for the young persons around the world to, if they must take action now. If they don't take action now, they won't have a plan to look forward to in the future. And it's important that we learn from the younger persons.
And just to Latonya here again, just to add a different perspective, if you look at tourism, right now our model of tourism is mass tourism, and if you look at global trends, most millennials are demanding more green tourism initiatives. And so I think with COVID-19, I think this is an opportunity for us to really expand us, really venture into more sustainable tourism initiatives where we can more, where we can focus more on our economic opportunities, decreasing economic leakages would more or less really put our environment at the forefront and more or less really create those social linkages for local communities. And I think youth are more or less changing the dynamics of tourism. Tourism, as we know right now, is at a standstill. However, it is a resilient industry, and I'm sure it will recover. But I think we should do, this is the time, especially for the youth, such as myself, to demand a different model and a different approach, especially here locally. We have an opportunity to really expand, like I said, and I think we should take advantage of it.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
I'd like to add to that also, but those are really good points, everybody. One thing I wanted to add was just, this generation particularly is more empowered than any previous generations to be able to get their voice out there. And a lot of, this generation is also very confident and happy to do that. However, one thing I have to say is most of us were told when we were young, oh, please fix the planet because my generation couldn't. And what worries me is that the next generation is going to be saying the same thing, because unfortunately there are some major changes that must happen. And that difficult conversation is gonna have to start from the top and talking about, economics and how we think about economics and how economics benefits people. But also one thing that concerns me is in a country like the Bahamas, so you can use an example like Europe, for example, and you have very highly educated children, and yes, they're marching around the planet saying all sorts of things. However, in the Bahamas, we have to be more cognizant than ever that we really need to amplify the education, because the information that these kids in our country are getting, is it the right information? What are they getting every day that's going to make them make that right or wrong choice? And I'm particularly growing more and more concerned about the misinformation campaigns that are out there and sponsored and dominating the conversation. And in countries like us, I feel we could be made vulnerable to those destructive misinformation campaigns actually dominating the information that's put out there.
Thank you for your views there. I have a question again. There's a question for Ms. Shirley from one of the participants, Dr. Mark Stevens here. In addition to biodiversity, is the conservation of geodiversity, including caves and blue holes, also considered part of the BNT's remit, especially since such landforms act as natural archives of climate change?
Yes, I was going to answer. I was in the middle of typing it. But yes, it absolutely is, because really we're thinking about ecosystems, aren't we? We're not just thinking about biodiversity conservation, but most of us who work in the Bahamas National Trust are biologists, so we are thinking from that point of view. But yes, we are definitely considering those very important structures that you're talking about. And also remember, those are very important ecosystems too, so they're very important to the BNT.
Thank you. Is there any other question from the participant? You can actually raise your hand and I can unmute you. You can directly shoot your question as well. Any question from the participants? If there is no question, I got one last question before we wrap up. Before we wrap. Okay, this one. Can Dr. Watson speak to the Bahamas National Energy Policy?
Okay. I see that's from Mr. Weech, I think. I'm trying to understand from which perspective, in terms of what the university is doing in that regard, or just generally my thoughts about the energy policy.
Mr. Weech, you are unmuted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dick. I'm sorry, I joined the conversation late and I apologize for that. But in Dr. Watson's presentations, he talked about climate action in a theoretical standpoint. My question speaks to something that is a national endorsed document called the National Energy Policy, and I would like his views on that in terms of the implementation. Is that a way forward in terms of dealing with climate action at the national level? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so as relates to the National Energy Policy, it's a document that I have my students almost all of my Physics 301 students read through. Of course, they don't go through all of the details. But I think that's a great source, a great reference in terms of the targets. As you know, that in some areas, the 4 major objectives, some of those we are a little behind on. The general target of 30%, and we've had discussion about this, 30% by 2030, I'm a little concerned about, but when the point is made about reduction in using the transport sector, I think is an area that we need to focus on. But the real challenge that I have with so I like a lot of the broad objectives. I think, again, getting back to the livelihoods and economics part, I think we need to develop that a bit more as we continue to revise the document, because I think it was at 2013. And so when we start talking energy, and I give an example, everyone says, well, let's get rid of BPL and let's have solar panels, right? And the question then is, what does that do in terms of jobs in the Bahamas? Not that we're sacrificing jobs for fossil fuels, or sacrificing jobs for the planet, but is there a way for us to think of an energy policy that not only looks at cheap energy, clean energy, but that also creates industry? And so I know that one of in the 2008 document energy policy, it was a little more, the biomass was a bit more emphasized in the 2013 energy policy, I think, or the draft, I should say. The 2008 was the draft. I am a big believer in exploring more biomass, clean biomass. I know that's something that's controversial, but I think it can be done responsibly, and to mix that in with solar. Again, solar is a variable source, and so you either have to rely on batteries. Solar is cleaner than fossil, but there's still some dirty elements in solar. And lastly, when you purchase solar panels, you're creating jobs elsewhere. And so what can we do to create jobs in the Bahamas that address sustainability? Because that's the sweet spot to me. Something that is sustainable, it's good for the environment, it makes financial sense, and it creates jobs. And I'll give you one last example. In Rwanda, which is a very progressive of the national states, doesn't have a lot of resources, but I think the approach is right, that the greatest resource is developing your people. They have one of their largest lakes. They have a problem with methane and carbon dioxide buildup, and it could be volatile. What they've done is developed a way of extracting that methane, right? So they're creating jobs, extracting that methane, creating economy. They're also providing an economic benefit. So I think that's why we need to think through some of the details so that we can come up with more innovative solutions. So that's a long answer. I like the document. There's some details that we can develop, and I'd like to focus more on job creation.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I know we are running out of time. I have 2 questions appearing in the chat. I think it's almost similar to what I'm going to shoot the next question for the panel before we try to wrap up. I'm going to put you on the spot now. If you are the Prime Minister of this country, what one policy that you will introduce to make changes to ensure the Bahamas is well prepared to face the brunt of environmental challenges that is landscaping this region, what do you think is the most important thing that you think that we as a country is not doing and we should be doing as far as environmental environmental challenges is concerned? Anyone can take the question.
Nobody wants to jump in. This is Shelley. I don't mind taking a first stab. I really think it's extremely important to be very aggressive when it comes towards climate change. Personally, I would work towards establishing a ministry that's something like the Ministry of Climate Change or something like that. That has also been done in other countries. I would also then arm that ministry with the ability to develop strategies that would then become written into law, holding the country accountable to the its, you know, what it's trying to achieve, rather than, you know, us having these policies year after year, they become out of date, never get implemented or followed. You know, I would be taking more of that sort of approach.
Thank you, Shelley.
Just to piggyback, Latonya, just to piggyback off of what Ms. Kat just said, I think it's important as a nation for us to really consider like more like where do we want to go and how do we want to get there in a climate change world, more or less. I recall we had a national development plan that more or less tried to initiate that discussion, but I'm not certain where that is at the moment. But I thought it was an indication of us trying to get to address the things that Shelley spoke about, really putting things pen to paper and really executing and at a national level. However, like I said, I'm not certain what's the status with that, but I think it's important for us to really think about national planning where we consider our economy, our society, as well as our environment.
Thank you, Toya. Sonia.
I think my thoughts are similar to Shelley. I'm obviously biased as a strong advocate for the university, so I would like to see perhaps an independent institute within the ambit of the University of the Bahamas that is especially charged with some very direct and clear objectives in terms of protection for the environment, for research and innovation, for connecting with the other ministries. But I think we need some strong body or institution that can link with all of the other ministries. I think that is one of the challenges that we have in the country, is that our agencies do not talk with each other enough, and that the heads of those agencies are sometimes not given the authority to act, or that there's a culture of bureaucracy. So I'm a little leery of it being a ministry, but I understand that ministries are important for land resources, etc. But in terms of an institute, I think you can move quickly. You can still be very accountable through your boards and how it's structured, but it can help to pull all of the various partners in, and like I said, it can be more accountable and more efficient and effective that way.
Thank you, Dr. Watson.
I just like Shelley, I agree with Shelley. I think we should have a ministry of climate change, and not just a ministry, not for, because typically when the politicians, they talk about climate change, they talk about it to sound good, but put some bite in that with a great budget, and perhaps making best a more significant part of that ministry. And one thing that I think that I would use more with that ministry also with the research that the University of the Bahamas does. I think I've been to the University of the Bahamas since I came back to the University of the Bahamas. I've seen the great work that many of those lecturers and the professors do on a daily basis, and the impact that they have on the students' lives. I think that should be integrated into that ministry as well, and use more of the lectures. We have some of the smartest people in the government at the University of the Bahamas, And I think they should make better use of them, because they have to impart that to the next generation. And the teachers are the first souls to pass that on to the next generation for the next war that they will face.
Okay, Nick.
I guess where I was going with my initial talk around uncertainty and information is that I really think the Bahamas needs to develop a strong base for understanding what our own needs are in terms of research to understand the specific impacts that we face and how we can mitigate those in the local context. And I think what we see time and time again, and why some of these initiatives don't work, is that we expect the rest of the world to do that work for us. And this is why we need a strong university, why we need institutions like the Bahamas National Trust, like our own forestry unit, like research organizations like our institute, is that we are producing our own knowledge for our own benefit, so that it's tailor-made. And so I think, you know, that dovetails into what everybody was saying, regardless of how you do it, whether it's through government organization and NGO, that we have some kind of program that comes up with a plan and answers the questions that we need to know to prioritize. Because, you know, there are so many potential issues. What we really need to know are what are the top priorities, what are the main impacts, and we need to do that kind of assessment for the Bahamas itself. And to my mind, that is not not really been done, or we don't have the information to do that properly.
Yeah, actually, exactly what you have said is one of the questions that I see in the chat. Given that we have observed changes in climate in terms of less pollution, for example, as a result of less human activity during COVID-19 pandemic, is anyone doing any studies to document these changes? So maybe this is a critical time for us to study, because as I've said at the beginning, when I presented, you see changes happening across the globe due to this pandemic and how it has impacted the environment. Are we doing similar studies here in the Bahamas to see the impact of the current pandemic on the environment, the impact of the lockdown? How is it impacting the environment? How is the impact in Nassau? You don't see people moving around now. Is there a change that is taking place in the environment? So the question here in the chat is, are we doing any studies?
Right, so I know that one of the things that we're doing at the university, we are focusing on atmospheric and aerosol sciences. So we do have monitors on campus, and we're looking at placing a few more, in fact, ordered around the country to monitor aerosols and pollution. But also Dr. Kabir is doing work on high altitude studies looking at particulate matter. I don't think he's been out, but that's something that we constantly do. We've been going to San Salvador and really looking at the quality of air from low altitude to very high altitude. He's using an innovative technique. I know it's not stepping on the work that Mr. Neely is doing. But beyond that, I'm not certain. I'm sure that a lot of faculty are thinking about it, because that is one of the questions and observations that people have been making, is that, you know, with this pandemic, it seemed to have solved, if we can look at it this way, some of the issues that people, if only temporarily, had about fossil fuel productions and emissions, etc. I just want to say one point too, and please forgive me, Dr. Vic, for saying this. I think why I advocate for, and this was a point I didn't emphasize enough, is that when we look at changing structures, a lot of times you may have to speak or address things that are controversial. And one of the core principles of the university is academic freedom. And so having a place where, and time and time again, I go to meetings, I meet with government officials, they say things, you know, you can say something off record, but is there fair now? I can't say this, the PS may say this, or sometimes it could be the PS, the minister may say this. And that's something that we know this is a reality in the country. And that is something that has to change, and that's why it's important that you have a space, a place where people can say very controversial things. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it, right? But it must be, of course, it must be responsible. But you shouldn't be fear of, you know, that if I talk about the government, or if I criticize this one, or if I talk about this wealthy family or these set of special interests, that there will be some reprisals. So you know, some backlash. So that's a point I want to make, but I kind of digress from the point.
Thank you so much. I know there are just a few more questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, I have to end the session. I know some of the panelists have to actually go off as well. I would like to thank all our 5 panel for accepting this invite to be in this session, share your thoughts for this important agenda. Although we are in a lockdown today, but I think it's good to see we had a lot of participants today, and some of the participants are out of this country as well. So it is great to see some international participants as well. Thank you all for who have attended the session today. The recording of the session will be made available for anyone who wants it. You can actually email research@ub.edu.bs. We look forward for your continuous support for the events of the University of the Bahamas. In support of the Earth Day today, I would like to encourage individuals, communities, and businesses to turn off non-essential electric lights for 1 hour from 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. as a symbol of commitment to the planet. You are going to be at home anyway, so it's a chance for you to shut down for 1 hour at least in support of this celebration of Earth Day. So once again, I would like to thank all of you for taking your time to be here. Thank you, and thank you for supporting the environmental needs of this world and also the country. So once again, stay safe. We hope to see you again in another forum. Thank you to all the 5 panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank you all.
much.
Great presentation.
It's great talking to you all, and have a very good Earth Day. And I think I'm going to try and strive for 2 hours.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank
Continue
you.
to be safe.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all. Bye.